with the National Agricultural and Rural Development Policy Center, and we're pleased to be hosting this webinar on rural broadband availability and adoption, evidence, policy challenges, and options from Brian Whitacre, Roberto Gallardo, and Sharon Strover, respectively from Oklahoma State University, Mississippi State University, and the University of Texas. And I think Brian's going to kick this off, so go ahead, Brian.
Okay, thanks a lot, Scott. Appreciate it. And we'll just go ahead and go to the first slide to kind of show how we're going to proceed here today. And Rosa's switching that over for me, I think. So again, here's the title from Scott. We've got Rural Broadband Availability and Adoption, Evidence, Policy Challenges, and Options. And before we get started, I just want to say that clearly OSU has the best logo of those three. Just kidding to my colleagues, of course. And in fact, I'm going to first start off by turning it over.
That's because it has burnt orange in it.
Okay. Thanks, Sharon, for that insight there. So let me go ahead and I'm actually going to turn it over to Roberto. I think we were having some mic issues with him, but he is going to talk us through kind of the data that we use and the setup that we're going to go through here today. He's our kind of data expert here. So Roberto, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to you, and we'll go through the first couple slides.
Thank you, Brian, Sharon. Thank you, everybody. We're going to go over the data utilized, and then of course the three research questions that were embedded in the proposal: the nature and extent of the broadband digital divide, the factors that strengthen or impede the broadband adoption, and the broadband's contribution to economic health. And then we're going to wrap up with a very interesting policy options and discussion. So if we can go to the next slide, please. So we can. We first felt it was necessary to define what metro, micro, non-core means. These are the core-based typology from the Office of Management and Budget. These definitions will be reviewed this year, but the ones we use for this study are from 2003. And basically, it's at the county level, and it considers a metro area, a metro county, if you have an urban core of more than 50,000 people, or your 25% of your labor force commutes to this urban core. That's important to highlight because some counties that are considered rural really appear as metro in these typology, but it's basically because their labor force is commuting to the urban core. The micropolitan counties have an urban core of between 10,000 and 49,000 people, or their 25% of workforce commutes to the urban core in that particular county, and then a neighboring county. And then the non-core are the most rural. They do not have an urban core of at least 10,000 people, and they do not meet any of the commuting requirements. So as we put it there, it's the rest of the counties. We consider non-metro the micropolitan and the non-core counties. Regarding broadband, of course, there's plenty definitions of what speeds to consider broadband and so forth, but we looked at the current, which is 4 megs down and 1 meg up, megabits per second, and then the historical is the 200 kilobits per second in at least one direction. Again, there's various thresholds depending on data sources, but that's basically the rule of thumb that we used here, and we're going to cover what data we use. So that's basically how we define metro and non-metro for this study. The data used, we have 3 different data sets, and I think that's one of the things that makes our study unique, is the ability to join all those data sets into one study. We used a current population survey. I'm sorry, Brian, are you trying to say something?
No, go ahead.
Oh, okay. The current population survey, we use the Internet Use Supplement. We have the 2003 and 2010 was the most current. Of course, we had over 40,000 observations. We did weight them according to we used the census weights, so they are representative of the nation, their household level, and we were able to differentiate between metro and non-metro as previously defined. We also looked at the Federal Communications Commission county level broadband adoption data, the FCC form 477, I believe it is, and this one was it looks at county levels, but it looks more at the adoption side of stuff. And here we have, of course, 3,000 plus counties. Every county in the nation was used, except for, well, no, that's for the spatial. We have 3,000 plus counties, and then finally we have the National Broadband Map, which is very, very new data that's coming out every 6 months, and the first batch of it came out, I believe, in the summer or the fall of 2011. This is very interesting. This is at the neighborhood level. I mean, census block level, and what we were able to do is we aggregated it to the county level, so we can then mesh it with the FCC county level broadband adoption data. So in other words, that's what we really think makes this study unique, is the fact that we were able to use multiple data sources for what we're trying to the research questions that we were trying to address. So again, we mesh adoption data with availability data. That's basically the bottom line of what this study achieved. So I'm going to turn it over to my colleague Brian now.
Thanks, Roberto. So again, thanks for kind of highlighting our value added here, that we're meshing this brand new availability data with some adoption data that we have. And I think before we get started with kind of some statistics here, Rosa, can we go ahead and bring over that description of your interest poll? Can we go ahead and show that to everyone and get you guys to click on that and kind of get a feel for who our audience is here today? If you guys wouldn't mind clicking on that and letting us know what best describes your interest in rural broadband.
I can move this down a little bit so people can still reply while you're talking, I think.
Okay. So I'm going to go ahead
still see that.
That's fine. I'm going to go ahead and start talking a little bit about some of the data that Roberto mentioned. First of all, the first data set we're going to start off with is the CPS household level data. And again, he mentioned we have data from about 40,000 households, about a quarter of which are classified as non-metro. And you can see there we got data from 2003 and 2010. And the big takeaway message here was that over that 7-year time frame, we still have a consistent 13 percentage point gap between metro and non-metro households. So again, back in 2003, we were talking about 24% or so of metro households versus 11% of non-metro, but that dramatic increases in both sectors, up to about 70% in metro by 2010 versus 57% in non-metro. But again, that gap has been consistent over time. So that was kind of a surprising finding initially, but I think even more surprising than just a basic consistency in the gap is what we uncovered next, which was basically to start looking at some specific characteristics associated with broadband adoption. So for instance, everyone kind of recognizes that broadband is associated with income and education. So once we started to look at that, I'm going to go ahead and use my little arrow here. And basically what we find is, if we first look at, this is the 2003 metro, non-metro rates down here. So again, of course, it increases as your income increases for both metro and then non-metro. So this is the 2003 non-metro, and you can see how the gap here is the triangle, the bolded triangle, the metro non-metro gap according to income. And then once we move to 2010, once again we have metro rates higher than non-metro rates, but the thing to me that stood out the most is that when you start looking at the 2010 gap, and you concentrate on just these lower income levels down here, we actually see that the 2010 gap is higher than it was back in 2003. So we'll talk about this more when we start talking about some policy prescriptions, but clearly not all income levels are, especially again, particularly in rural areas, are taking advantage of this. You can see that the gap for the higher income levels, it seemed to diminish up here in 2010, but when we start talking about these lower income levels, again, it has increased. So that's something we noticed right away. And then we move on to the next one. Same thing we kind of find with education. Again, we've got our 2003 broadband adoption rates by education, and no surprise, metro again is over non-metro. The gap here is this green triangle, and then our 2010 metro versus non-metro, and again we see some increases here at the higher levels of education, but at this lower level of education, what we find is again, the 2010 gap is higher than it was in 2003. So again, that was surprising to us, and it's going to have policy implications. We really need to be focusing on these households with characteristics that have traditionally led to lower levels of access, because those gaps are actually increasing over time. Basically the same thing with regard to age. So once we get to the higher, the elderly percentage of population, you get here, these people here over 60. You can see the percentages are pretty low back in 2003. Again, everything increased for both metro and non-metro, but once again, that gap for the elderly is higher in 2010 than it is in 2003. So that highest age category there of 60 plus, the metro non-metro gap is actually higher with the most recent data than it was back in 2003. So that's a consistent pattern that we saw for income, education, and age. And then we also see it for racial characteristics, racial and ethnic characteristics. So again, you can see the 2003 metro versus non-metro here, and then the 2010 metro versus non-metro. And what we kind of focus again here on is whether the 2010 gap is higher or lower for some specific demographics. And of course, what you can see is for both Black and Hispanic categories, the 2010 gap is higher than it was in 2003. And for other race, the gap is higher in 2010 than it was in 2003. So again, some specific demographics seem to be losing ground over time, and that's something we're really concerned about, and we're going to be really focusing on in terms of trying to increase the adoption rates among specific demographic categories for rural areas. So that's kind of the basics of some of the CPS demographic data. We also had a question in the CPS about what is the primary reason that you're not adopting, and this is only for non-metropolitan households, and then we got the data again in 2003 and 2010, and two things kind of stand out the most to me here. The first one is that the dominant answer here was no need, okay, and that actually increased over the period between 2003 and 2010. Again, this does have policy implications. It basically suggests that, hey, we really need to be educating people about what are the value added of broadband in rural areas. What can you do with it? So it's kind of a take on what is the value of broadband for me. Another thing that's interesting in these data is that this area right here for not available is pretty low. Okay, the people saying the reason I don't use broadband is because it's not available to me is less than 10% in all cases, and it's actually shrinking over time. Okay, so as more and more people start to use the internet, the people who are left say, well, it's not nearly for me, I have no need for it. And then there's a shrinking percentage of people that are actually saying, yeah, it's not available in where I live. So that's some interesting stuff in regards to why people are not adopting. And so I think we've got one more slide here using the CPS household level data, and that is what type of connection they have. And so again, we've got information here on metro versus non-metro in 2003 and metro versus non-metro in 2010. So the first thing to kind of take away from it, we're going to focus here on the non-metro portion, is if you look back in 2003, a big chunk of those connections were in cable. Okay, we're talking about over 50% of the connections that were in cable. And once you move to 2010, you can see that those numbers are significantly lower. Only about 25-30% in 2010. So again, a lot of that shift has increased here for DSL. The DSL has increased over that time. Another big chunk of where the increases come from is right here in our cellular connections. Okay, so a lot of people might have expected that. You're talking about cell phone use, wireless use. You can see it was almost negligible in 2003, much more in 2010. But again, still a minority player when compared to cable and DSL. So this is again the household level data that we kind of wanted to go over first, and I'm going to move on to some additional data here that we talked about in the beginning. That is the FCC Form 477 data. So this is all again at the household level that we've seen so far. Now we're going to move on to the FCC data, and again, the previous data was household level. The FCC data is at the county level. So it basically says for your county, what category of adoption are you in? Do you have less than 20% broadband adoption, between 20 or 40, 40 or 60, or 60 to 80, or 80 and above? So they have 5 categories of adoption here for your particular county. And again, we have this data starting in 2008 and going to 2011. So we've tried to map out here what's happening in terms of broadband adoption by county category. And again, the other nice thing about the FCC data is we can break out by micro and non-core. We're not just relegated to only having one category for all non-metro. We can get the more rural counties that are captured here in the non-core area. So again, some interesting things that pop out of this data. If we look first at 2008, we had a lot of rural, very non-core counties that had low levels of adoption. Okay, so these lowest categories here are below 20% and 20 to 40%. We're talking about almost 60% of all non-metro counties that were in that category. Okay, and you can see how that's changed over just a 3-year period. Okay, they significantly dropped down. We're talking about only 25-30% now too. So again, that's the big change there in terms of a significant amount of counties are moving from this very low base of how many people are adopting up to a higher base. And again, you can see here in this higher 60 to 80%, very few in the non-core back in 2008, and moved up to a significant increase here in 2011 for these non-core areas. You can also look and see what's happened in the more metropolitan areas. So again, you can see, a lot of them are in these 2 categories here between 40 and 80% adoption, and you can kind of see how that's translated over here. They've seen some gains. Certainly, this 60 to 80% has gotten bigger, but not a huge shrink here in the 40 to 60, and a slight reduction here in the 20 to 40. But they haven't quite seen the dramatic gains that we saw in these non-core areas, and that's something that we'll see here in a slide or two when we look at the trends over time between these two groups. So essentially what we did here to get kind of an aggregate measure of how counties are progressing is to basically say, okay, if you're in this first category, less than 20%, you get a 1. If you're in this category, you get a 2. This category is a 3, 4, and 5, etc. And that way we can weight these by the number of counties that have a 1 versus 2 versus 5 and kind of see how metro compares to non-core over time. So that's what we did in this next slide, and you can see that there actually has been some progress. Okay, so back in 2008, the gap between metro and micro was about 0.44 once we aggregate that. So again, the metro had an average of somewhere between 3 and 3.5, which again would be between 40 and 60%, and you can see how that compares to the micro and the non-core. But again, the takeaway here is that over the 3-year period, even though metro has gained, both micro and non-core have gained more. Okay, so that gap is shrinking from 0.44 to 0.33 in the micro areas, from 0.82 to 0.58 in these non-core areas. So even though when we looked at the household level data, we saw a consistent 13 percentage point gap, and that's again between 2003 and 2010. When we start looking at kind of more recent data at the county level data, we do see some good news here for the micro and non-core areas. We see some increases in adoption, particularly from a very low base back in 2008. So there is some work getting done at getting these households online and connected to broadband. But again, there still is a gap with the metro areas in terms of both counties that we're talking about here. Okay, so let's move forward. And we also, another good thing about this FCC data is that it's by county, so we can map it. So again, we called on our GIS specialist Roberto to map this stuff for us, and you can see here the household broadband adoption rates are listed over here. So the very dark red is the lowest levels of adoption, all the way up to the very darkest blue is the highest levels of adoption, and there are some spatial patterns here. You can clearly see, for instance, in my home, where I'm living here in Oklahoma, the southeastern part of the state has very low levels of adoption. You can also see over here in Mississippi, there's quite a few very red pockets. Same over here in Georgia, quite a few very low levels of adoption. And conversely, up here in the Northeast, you can see some very high levels of adoption. Okay, so some with 80% plus of households, pockets of adoption, pretty impressive. But that said, even out in western Oklahoma is very sparsely populated, but we have some, pushing 60, 80+% out here. If you look at the suburbs suburbs of Denver, you can see some, you know, a lot of pockets of 80+%. You've got some 80% here surrounded by 20 to 40. So there is some spatial patterns here, and we try to capture some of that later on in some of our work, but it's some interesting stuff to look at. And again, this is the latest data we have from 2011 at the county level.
Well, looks like there's some implications for state level policy in some of this too, Brian. If you take a look, you know, where some of these breaks occur along state lines, like between Virginia and North Carolina, and maybe over here in northern Georgia versus North Carolina, South Carolina. It seems like some states, you know, can look just across their borders and see that there's some maybe issues in how they're rolling this out compared with counties that are very similar economically.
Yeah, that's a really good observation, and particularly like you're saying on that in those borders that are just separated by, or those counties that are just separated by a border. So that's certainly something to look at, kind of at a lower micro level detail in terms of, you know, what in a particular state might be holding them back or boosting them. So that's definitely something to think about in the future. So once we looked at this initial data about, okay, where are, you know, just generally pockets of low adoption or pockets of high adoption, what we initially thought was, well, okay, let's see if there's any kind of, you know, correlation with the number of providers in those areas. That's, you know, that seems like it would make sense. You have more providers, you have more choice. Maybe that's going to lead to higher levels of adoption. But what we found was the relationship between adoption and simply the number of providers is not overwhelming. So again, for example, here in Oklahoma, we have some down here with very high numbers of providers, but low levels of adoption. And again, out here, we have some with a very low number of providers, but high levels of adoption. And you can kind of see that across different parts of the country. You know, you'll see some red-colored counties here with high circles or with large circles, and some again dark blue with relatively low circles. So that's there. We did explore that relationship, and we did actually look at some correlation between those two. So correlation coefficients basically tell you a very simple measure of the relationship between adoption levels and the number of providers. And again, that number here was just 0.32 for all counties. You know, a high correlation would be somewhere closer to 0.8, 0.9. So this is certainly not a very high correlation coefficient that we're talking about. And again, if you focus just on the non-core counties, it's very low. Okay, 0.09. So again, certainly no high level of correlation between simply increasing the number of providers and getting broadband adoption rates to increase. And this is something that we did test later, and we'll have more to say about in a couple different models that we ran. So again, for now, we're just kind of looking at some geographical trends here, and we've got one more that deals with another measure of broadband availability, and this is new data. This is a different measure of broadband. This is actually a 3 megabytes down, 768 up that was available in 2010. And so we can actually see here the percentage of the population that does not have any wired broadband access available to them. So it's wired only, and it's the percentage of population in that county that does not have access to, again, a 3 megs down, 768 up. And you can clearly see that some pockets are, you know, very, very low levels of availability. This is I actually grew up here in Virginia, bordering West Virginia. You can see the pockets here are very poor in terms of availability, and no surprise if you look at the metro areas here, they're generally going to be, you know, where the percentage of population with no access is very small. So you can see kind of most of the gray areas have the smallest number of the smallest circles in them. And again, when you get to those non-core and micro areas, those do get bigger. So we can see some trends here in terms of, again, up in the Northeast, not very bad, but certainly the more mountainous parts of the country do have some issues there with wired availability. And one thing we try to test in our results here is to figure out, does that lack of availability impact these adoption levels that we've been seeing? So we'll get more into that in a second. Another way of looking at this is just kind of more numerically as opposed to graphically. So we basically said, okay, let's look at metro, micro, and non-core, and the percentage of counties that have, you know, either low levels of very low availability. So this would be, you know, in metro counties, there's about 40% of all metro counties that have less than 2% of their population without any kind of access. So that's really good. Okay, you would expect that. Metropolitan, more densely populated, they're going to have probably better broadband availability, and they do. When we shift that over to non-core, we find that, well, only about 5% of the non-core counties have this really good level of availability, whereas a big chunk of them, we're talking almost 30%, have very poor levels of availability. Okay, so more than 40% of the population in that county lacks wired broadband at that higher 3 meg level. Okay, and that's a big chunk. Okay, and you can see how that's dramatically different from micro, and again how that definitely shifts between metro, micro, and non-core from the ones that lack a lot of wired infrastructure versus the ones that have good access to wired infrastructure. So this is kind of the well, I think we have a couple more slides here about using the National Broadband Map data. Okay, again, I'm just highlighting here that that's a very big chunk of population lacking access to broadband. We do also have information on downloads and upload speeds in 2010 and 2011. Again, this is from the National Broadband Map. A couple things I want to point out here. As you might expect, the non-core areas don't have very large percentage of their counties that have this very high speed of download available to them. Okay, we're talking about 25 megs or more, whereas more of the metro counties do. And again, a more typical speed you might expect to see in a non-core county is between, again, you've got about 3 megs down here, 6 megs here, so that's more typical, whereas in a metro county you more expect to see kind of the 10 to 25. One point I want to make here is that if you look over here in 2010, you see, hey, look, we've got all these people that are offering, wow, 25 megs or more, and we basically say that's not really the case. If you read the report, we basically say that this is overstated. There are lots of states that didn't report this at all. There are some states that we think claim this high speed that were inaccurate. So we think once we move to 2011, the data is much better. Okay, so this is a more realistic picture of here's what's actually happening in terms of speed in non-core areas versus metro areas. And again, you can see, yeah, we would expect them to have lower download speeds, and that's basically what we show here. But again, we don't pay a whole lot of attention to this, what's happening here in 2010, because we don't think that data is very usable. That was the first time they reported this speed data, and we think there were some issues with that. So that was download. We're going to move also to upload. Again, the same thing. We certainly don't expect this big chunk to have 6 megs or greater of upload speed. We think this is much more realistic. And again, as you might expect, the biggest chunks in non-core counties were here in the about 768K up to 1.5K up. And again, you can see over here in the more metro, we see these faster speeds, which again would be expected. Okay. So again, there were some data issues with that 2010 version. Moving on to our modeling. So we're going to start talking now about how we modeled some of the, use some of this data to model, answer some of the questions about what's impacting broadband adoption. So this first section, we're going to talk specifically about CPS data. So this is household level data. And again, we just ran some basic models here about what had a positive impact on household broadband adoption, what had negative impact. And as you might have expected, the positive impact were things like higher levels of income, higher levels of education. If you had a home business, if you had internet at work, all those had a positive effect on increasing broadband, the likelihood of broadband adoption. And we also found that specific racial and ethnic categories, so blacks, Hispanics, and also non-metropolitan status had a negative impact on the likelihood of household adoption. So these were kind of expected things. This has been shown in the literature previously. What we tried to do is also answer, okay, what availability measures impact adoption? Is there some kind of threshold where we can say, for example, if there's a certain number of providers, is that going to positively impact adoption? And what we ended up finding is that yes, if we do have high availability, so again, less than 15% of our population without access to that wired broadband, then we can say, yes, that has a positive impact on broadband adoption. And conversely, if we have a low number of providers, so if there's less than 3 providers in a county, that's actually going to have a negative impact on adoption. So we already controlled for all these things up here, and then we basically added in these availability measures and found out, what was either positively or negatively impacting adoption in terms of strictly availability. So it's kind of in addition to the things you might expect, can we say that specific thresholds for providers or availability have an impact on adoption? And again, kind of the takeaway here, or sorry, the other variables that did not have a statistical impact were download and upload speeds. We didn't find any result that would suggest if you have very high levels of download speeds or very high levels of upload speeds, that would have an impact on adoption. We didn't find anything like that. We also didn't find if you have a certain high number of providers that would impact adoption at all. So the only ones we found a result for was this availability, this high measure of availability, and this low number of providers. And so again, this was for the household level data specifically for adoption. The next thing we tried to do is say, okay, we know we've had this consistent 13 percentage point gap over time. Okay, so again, 13 percentage points here between metro and non-metro in 2003, 13 percentage points in 2010. And so I used a decomposition technique to figure out what is driving this gap. Is it the fact that in non-metro areas they have typically lower education and income levels than metro? Or is it the relationships between education and broadband adoption or income and broadband adoption? So the characteristic differences here is the things like, okay, we expect non-metro to have lower levels of education and income. We expect them to have a more elderly population. So we basically replaced the characteristics in the non-metro area with those for metro, and we found that about half of this gap in both 2003 and 2010 was due to characteristic differences. Okay, so that's the first kind of takeaway here. If we gave non-metro households the exact same characteristics as metro households in terms specifically of education, income, age, about half of that gap disappears. Okay, so if we're talking about this, it would go up to about 63% in non-metro. Okay, but the interesting thing was once we added in the availability measure in 2010 and replaced that with a metro measure of availability, then 90% of the gap is explained. Okay, so it goes from 50% to 90%, and that's because we added in these higher levels of availability that were found in the non-metro area. So this clearly suggests that availability is playing an issue in this gap. And again, we'll have some more to say about that later on in the policy section and some of our other findings. But this certainly suggests that not only are non-metro areas lagging behind because of lower levels of education and income, but also this availability measure is certainly important. Okay, so we also had this kind of a decomposition done over time. We saw this huge increase in non-metro areas between 2003 and 2010. And again, we tried to figure out, is that because over that time, non-metro areas have either gained education or gained income, and we find that's not the case. Okay, only a very small percent is because of characteristic differences in time. What it's due to instead is because the likelihood of adoption for any kind of income and education has increased over time. So this is basically predicted by diffusion theory. Broadband's becoming more common. Everyone's going to be more likely to adopt. It's not because you suddenly have a lot of well-educated household heads or much more income. It's more because the parameters associated with each of those is become more likely to adopt. So that's something that kind of fits in exactly what we would have expected. Switching now to the county level FCC data, we're once again going to try to explain what's driving broadband adoption at the county level. And again, we have a positive impact of things like education, income, population, though interestingly, in only the non-core counties, we did not find an impact of population. So higher populations in these non-core counties does not necessarily suggest increases to broadband adoption levels. The other interesting thing we found was we looked across a lot of different industries, and we found that if counties had high concentrations of jobs in things like real estate or information in those sectors, then that positively impacted broadband. So that was an interesting finding for us at the county level. For a negative impact, this one was kind of surprising. These non-farm proprietors are basically entrepreneurs, okay, and we kind of expected this. We almost hoped to find if we had more non-farm proprietors, then maybe they would have higher levels of broadband access or vice versa. But this is going to be a common theme for us. We found a negative relationship between the number of non-farm proprietors or entrepreneurs and broadband adoption rates. So that's something we didn't expect to find, but again was consistent throughout our findings. And we also again found these negative impacts of specific racial and ethnic categories. And interesting, that was driven by these non-core areas. So if you're in a non-core area with high levels of Hispanics or African Americans, that's actually going to have a negative impact on your broadband adoption rate. And so once again, we looked at, okay, what availability measures are going to impact adoption in addition to what we just talked about for the characteristics. And we found that in 2010, we had a positive impact of a high number of providers. So if you have over 6 providers, that's going to positively impact your adoption category. And if you had a low number of providers, that's going to negatively impact your adoption categories. Or if you had low download speeds, less than 3 megs advertised. So this is kind of expected. You know, high number of providers positively impacts it, low number negatively impacts it. But the surprising thing was once we moved to 2011, the emphasis shifted from providers to download speeds. Okay, so if you had a high download speed in 2011, that positively impacted your adoption. Or if you had a low download speed, that negatively impacted your adoption. So we kind of saw this shift between 2010 and 2011 from we're focusing here on the number of providers to now people are starting to say, well, speed is more important. Okay, so if you're offering me high speeds, I'm going to be more likely to get that adoption into my next category, etc. So that was an interesting finding using the FCC data. So again, there's a shift from the number of providers to download speed over that period. That was interesting for us. And another thing we wanted to try to do was to explain the increases in county level rates between 2008 and 2010. And so basically all this chart does is lay out the number of counties that either had an increase, because again, remember there were 5 categories, so less than 20% would be a 1, 20 to 40 would be a 2. So in the non-core counties, we basically said 58% of them had an increase over this time. Okay, and some of them increased two categories over this time. Some of them lost, a lot of them stayed the same. So we basically try to figure out what's driving that increase. So again, significant percentage of counties increased their adoption, and as you might expect, if you had higher population or an increase in either population or income, that led to higher levels of adoption. And here's a kind of something that we've been pointing at. If you did experience an increase in residential broadband providers, that also led to an increase over this time. So this is something that kind of is counter to the correlation, the low correlation coefficients that we found before. But this is a more specific model that accounted for a lot of other things. So this does find that if you do increase the number of providers over that time, you are more likely to increase adoption. And as you might expect, a negative impact here, higher unemployment rates. This is right in the middle of the recovery from the Great Recession. So unemployment rates did go up. That led to lower levels of increased adoption, and that's kind of expected. Okay. And I know at least a couple of people on the call today are interested in this, what we did here for Connected Nation. We did a pre-post study. For those of you not familiar with Connected Nation, they work with quite a few states. I think it's like 13 states to help them engage the local providers and the local community to try to increase both availability and adoption. And they were kind enough to give us some data about when they started working with each of those counties in the states they've been working with. And what we found was they had at least 2, because the thing we were interested in, we had this FCC data that began in 2008. And so we found 2 states that participated in Connected Nation, but after they first started gathering this FCC data. I think they were Ohio and Tennessee. And so what we then did was compared those with non-participants over the same time period, and basically then we said, okay, what happened to each of those different participants or non-participants between 2008 and 2011? Can we say that this participation led to higher rates of adoption or higher number of providers, etc.? And this kind of fancy word up here, all we're doing is really matching these participants on with counties that had similar characteristics of things like population, income, education. So there should be otherwise similar. So we're not taking we're not comparing apples and oranges. They should be very similar. So what we ended up finding was, yes, if you did participate in Connected Nation, they did exhibit a higher number or an increase in the number of residential providers, particularly in non-core areas. Okay, so if you're in a non-core area, you're going to have a significantly higher number of providers over this period than the non-participants. But the kind of negative finding that we had was that only metro counties saw higher increases in broadband adoption if you participate in this program. So if you went in this non-core, if you lived in a non-core county, you were more likely to have more providers, but you actually didn't see any increase as compared to these other guys in the number of in the percentage of or the levels of adoption. So we found some positives and some negatives associated with Connected Nation, and again, I'm sure we'll be sharing more details about that in our report. So let me go over some kind of the last set of slides here before I turn it over to Sharon, and that is we tried to model the contribution of broadband to economic health in rural areas, and we had 3 distinct modeling efforts. And don't worry too much about the different types here. I'm just going to walk through them briefly, but the main point is we list them in order of increasing claims that can be made about causality. So this first one, we're just kind of saying, well, there's some kind of correlation between broadband and these different economic health measures. And these other 2 we're really trying to get at, can we actually make the claim that broadband causes economic growth in these rural areas? So we have a lot of different variables of economic health variables of interest. We already mentioned kind of the non-farm proprietors, which is kind of entrepreneurs or self-employed. We're also interested in the creative class, the income of these entrepreneurs, the overall median household income, the percentage in poverty, number of firms with paid employees, total employed. So these are all the things we're interested in measuring and seeing if broadband had an impact on them. And some of the availability measures we wanted to test, well, these first 4 here are good things. Okay, we've got high numbers of providers, we've got high adoption rates, we've got high download speeds, low percentage without broadband, so that's a good thing. And then these last 4 here are bad things. So low number of providers, low adoption, low download, high percentage of people without broadband. And so once we go through our first results here, this is for the, again, kind of correlation for the cross-section spatial models. I list here what we did for some control variables, and the primary variables of interest, again, are those adoption and availability measures that I just mentioned. And what we found is if you have a percentage of population without broadband or a low number of providers, that does impact all 7 categories that I just listed there for the economic health. And in particular, increases in the percent population without access, so this is a bad thing, that actually decreases your non-farm proprietor average income, your total median household income, the number of firms with paid employees, and the total number employed. So this is a bad thing. Low levels of broadband availability is associated with a decrease in all these things. Okay, so that's a nice finding there, and that says, hey, availability is important. And again, we found that all these positive adoption and availability measures had this positive impact on total jobs and number of firms, and the low indicators all had a negative impact. Okay, so this is basically what we had exactly hoped to find. Very high levels of broadband is good for the economy. Very low levels of broadband is bad for the economy. But again, this is just a correlation model, so we kind of move on to our next one here, where we talk about another kind of regression. And here we're looking at changes in economic health over a very short period of time, really 2008 to 2010. So we're looking at, did our median household income increase over this time, and if so, was it due to changes in broadband? And what we found is yes, if we had communities or counties that had increases in broadband adoption, they did show a positive impact on both median household income and total employment. And again, we're only focused here on the non-metro counties, which to me is particularly impressive. It's only focused on recent adoption since 2008 and over a very short period of time, again, only about 3 periods. So if we can really ramp up broadband adoption in these non-metro counties, we do have measurable results on both income and employment, which is pretty nice stuff. And again, if we do switch over to providers as opposed to adoption, we don't find any impact. So the focus here should not be on just number of providers, it should be on adoption. You have to have people adopting and using the technology and not just providing it to them. And then lastly here we have something called propensity score matching on these economic health indicators. So we basically compare 2 groups, a treated group which has either high or low levels of broadband, and then otherwise similar non-treated groups. Okay, so they're matched based on probabilities of reaching the broadband threshold, and we're looking really here at changes between 2001 and 2010. And what we can say is if we do have high levels of adoption, again, adoption here, not availability, that has positive impact on economic growth, including increased income and reducing poverty and unemployment. And on the same kind of topic, low levels of adoption have negative impacts on number of firms, employment, and unemployment rates. So these are, again, exactly what we would hope to find. High levels of adoption, good things happen. low levels of adoption, bad things happen. And again, the kind of takeaway here is that adoption thresholds are more important than availability. So again, we ran all this with both adoption and availability. We didn't find anything when we looked just at availability, but we did find it when we focused on adoption. So that's the key thing that we're trying to get to here. And at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Sharon, who is one of the more well-recognized policy experts in this area.
Okay, that was a pretty breathless investigation with a lot of results. I think that one takeaway we hope this report and this presentation will give you is the convergence of a lot of different techniques and different data sets around a core set of findings. So we have just a few slides that try to highlight what this convergence is. And first, as we said at the outset, the almost point of departure for this study is the fact that we still have this gap that has remained fairly steady at about 13 percentage points over the last decade or so, from 03 to 010. We know as well that the gap has increased among certain segments of the population, and you heard a lot of the investigations looking and breaking out income and education and age effects, particularly within the non-core regions. That said, of course, one thing to bear in mind is that the overall statistical picture is better, in that there have been huge improvements and huge gains in both broadband availability and adoption, which makes the fact that we still have this gap all the more striking. We have again seen these factors that were identified early on: income, education, age, race and ethnicity, and location, playing a role in broadband adoption. And we know that availability as well is the kind of the sine qua non here. You can't have adoption without availability. So our findings do emphasize and explore the role of availability in the availability adoption sequence here. When we try to probe more deeply on some of the impact of both broadband availability and especially broadband adoption on quality of service and employment in particular, we found that a few job categories, most notably real estate and information sectors, did have an impact on adoption rate, as did broadband speed. And Brian just highlighted the fact that we noticed this fairly recently in the 2010 to 2011 statistics. In particular, speed does increasingly seem to matter, and I think we can expect to see that exacerbated in the future. The Connected Nations study, which matched regions that had Connected Nations services with those that did not, found that the number of providers did have a positive increase, but did show a positive increase, but there was no increase in adoption. When we backed out of that and looked at some additional analyses, we found that low levels of adoption, providers, and availability were overall associated with these lower household incomes, higher levels of poverty, and decreased numbers of firms and employment. And then when we look more squarely at the economic impacts, we found with fairly robust analyses that in fact broadband adoption does have an impact on household income and on total employment. And this study joins the ranks of relatively few studies that is actually able to say that we found this. The model results found that adoption thresholds have more impact on economic health indicators than availability. So that puts our emphasis at this juncture squarely on the demand side, which is not to say that you can have demand without availability. So in terms of policy options, drawing broadband infrastructure especially to non-core regions that are less economically robust, should be a front and center policy option, but it's clearly not the entire solution. We need to attend to the demand side, and that leads us to suggest that there should be focused adoption programs specifically targeting populations with lower levels of income and education, as well as racial and ethnic minorities and older people in rural regions. Some of the analyses that Brian just went over suggest some of the differences between what we can expect with a diffusion model and what we can expect with other place-based, characteristic-based differences. And we found that limited exposure to broadband can actually depress people's interest. If you don't know what it is, if you don't see anybody using it, the pragmatic implication is that this sort of limited exposure would lead to or contribute to disinterest in broadband. And this suggests that perhaps demonstration sites in community anchor institutions like schools and libraries could get behind some highly public demonstrations in order to reach the people who do not normally see the utilization of broadband in their everyday environments. And those sorts of demonstrations can build on diffusion factors by enabling people to try broadband, to see how it works, and to recognize that it is really not all that difficult to use computers and to access the internet. Some of our analyses are of course taking place in a context in which there's more and more attention to 3 and 4G availability, and of course some of the FCC's policies are focusing increasingly on wireless deployment. We'd like to caution that wireless deployment may be helpful, but we're skeptical that a lot of the productivity gains and strong economic advantages of broadband could be realized strictly through wireless deployment, depending on the devices that people are using in that environment. We clearly see that we need additional data related to price. Price and affordability is identified over and over again as a factor that inhibits people's adoption, and again, increasingly, speed as well. And we simply need to continue to gather data. There is no really good data on price. There's some data on affordability, and we're getting better and better data on speed. So to kind of wrap up, we thought that we would share with you the table of contents to the report so you can get a sense of the not only the length of the report, but also some of the analytic depth that is addressed there. So I think with that, I'll wrap up, and I guess we have a little bit of time to attend to some of the questions that have popped up in chat.
Yeah, thanks a lot. We'll go ahead and open it up to questions from the audience via chat. We've also got these couple polls that people hopefully can fill out as well while we're waiting for questions to come in on the chat box. So hopefully that's ready to go. People can fill those out. This webinar is being recorded, and it will be archived at the address that's down there at the bottom of your screen. So if you want to share this with other individuals who may not have been able to be on the line today, that's going to be available. There were some questions about the publications. The 2-page overview is currently posted on the website that's listed there at the bottom. So you can get it there, and then within the next 24 hours or so, the main report that you have that has all the detail will be there as well. And I think ultimately we're also planning on an intermediate version with that'll be about 20 pages or so. So there'll be kind of three versions of it available at that ultimately. Brian, did you want to talk a little bit about some of the questions that had come in from Andy Lewis about data sources and things like that?
Yeah, let me just try to run through a couple of the questions that have come in. We got some good ones about, how surprised are we by the gap, and I'll just say that Kathy said that she thinks it's pretty relevant or close to what they're seeing in California. I think the same thing here in Oklahoma. We actually have done some independent surveys here in Oklahoma. We still do see that probably at least a 10 percentage point gap, and from some of our on the ground work. Someone else asked about the fixed wireless data, and I think that is included in the other in this CPS, but I'd have to go back and check on that. Our report should have specific breakouts by all the categories. And then yeah, Andy was asking in particular about how his state kind of, he thought the map showed Wisconsin looked pretty good, while a new report by the FCC said they ranked 38th. And I said, we certainly could share the data. He's saying maybe it's because they used a different data of broadband than we did, and that could certainly be the issue.
Yeah.
Someone else is asking about.
I was just going to say, I didn't know offhand which measure the FCC is using, but I would suspect that they're using their updated measure of broadband, which is the higher speed levels.
And that makes perfect sense. If you look at, Oklahoma is not doing too bad if you use the dated version of broadband definition, but once you shift to that 4 meg threshold, we certainly probably are ranked lower than earlier as well. So that could very well be. And I think Chris from Connected Nation says they have seen something similar, about a 10 percentage point gap in their states they're working with. So it kind of tracks with what we've got. Someone asked about the PowerPoint for this, and it should be available on the same website where the announcement was made. Is that right, Scott?
That's correct. Yeah, that will be posted here in the next hour or two, I would think. So we kind of wait until after the webinar to post that as well, in case the authors have any last-minute changes. So, but that will be on there very soon.
Okay. And again, I want to thank. I know a couple people, probably provided some input onto this report, and again, I appreciate you guys looking through this. This is a pretty exhaustive effort. You can see the whole report is pushing 90 pages, and it's got some what I think is a good bit of analysis combined with some basic descriptive statistics that are useful for really a wide variety of people. I know some people are interested in particular programs and the economic health. It looks like, from what I can see here from the survey results, that most people are more interested in just the digital divide, basic statistics, but also people are interested in the model results, and it looks like a pretty good breakout actually. So I will, again, we will hope to get that the final report out to you guys, and please, we're always interested in hearing feedback on it. We are going to try to convert these into some journal articles here in the near future, and just kind of move forward from there.
Steve Cook had a question about this inverse relationship between rural internet adoption and rural proprietors, and I had some thoughts on that as well. I'm wondering if maybe some of these are, proprietors of necessity, and maybe they're not. They might be kind of doing this without a lot of resources, and I'm wondering if you get the same relationship if you start talking about small enterprises that actually have employees.
And that's exactly what we hypothesized when we found this relationship. We were suggesting that, yes, we would expect broadband to have a positive relationship for some entrepreneurs that are, again, doing specific types of activities, but other ones, kind of the like you're saying, the necessity entrepreneurs, maybe they want nothing to do with broadband, and that's just something that we kind of teased out with that relationship. So we did we did at least hypothesize about that relationship in the paper, and we're always looking to hear more theories as to why that popped up. And again, that was a consistent finding across what we did.
I think we have time for maybe one more question. If somebody wants to be really quick on the keyboard, we can try to get those in. It is a comprehensive report, so I do encourage everybody to take a look at that the next day or two when that comes up on our website. Oh, and Kathy wants to know how contact information, so maybe the three authors can maybe put that in the chat box.
So yeah, just feel free to email me or check out my website and give me a call. Yeah, always willing to talk rural broadband with people who are doing this kind of work. And Andy has
Andy
an
Lewis.
interesting comment. Yeah.
Yep.
Here about co-ops. That is interesting. I'm not sure if that data is available in the national broadband map or not.
Okay, well, I think we can turn off the